Good morning. My name is Lyle Morris, Senior Fellow for Foreign Policy and National Security at the Center for China Analysis at the Asia Society Policy Institute based in Washington, D.C. It's my great pleasure to welcome everyone to this morning's webinar titled New Centers of Gravity: How China and India are Vying for Influence in the European Union. India and China are arguably two of the most important actors in Asia for the European Union. Starting in the late 1990s, EU-China trade and investment surged, following Beijing's entry into the World Trade Organization in 2001. Today, China remains the EU's largest trading partner with substantial European investments across the mainland. The EU-China relationship, however, has deteriorated markedly since the EU introduced a three-part strategy in 2019 based on partnership, competition, and systematic rivalry with China. The relationship has been undermined by China's support for Russia's aggression in Ukraine and its increasingly anti-Western foreign policy that aims to alter some components of the international rules-based system. Meanwhile, the economic relationship appears to be shifting due to structural changes in China's economy and policies cultivating self-reliance. This is coupled with the EU's growing critical dependence on China in some sectors. Europe has seemed to accept that relations with China will not return to their pre-pandemic state. Meanwhile, India has become an increasingly important player, with some in the EU seeing it as a counterbalance to Beijing. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen recently expressed a desire to establish a new strategic agenda with India and upgrade its strategic partnership with, quote, the largest democracy in the world, unquote. So this webinar will unpack the current state of EU-China and EU-India relations. As India's influence and economic appeal grow, can New Delhi become a viable alternative to China for European business leaders and policymakers? And how will the EU address its complicated relationship with Beijing? Finally, how is Brussels incorporating India into its strategies to address a potential crisis in Asia or the broader Indo-Pacific? So to help us break all this down, I'm very pleased to be joined by Philippe Le Corre, Senior Fellow at the Asia Society Policy Institute's Center for China Analysis, and Akshay Mathur, Senior Director of the Asia Society Policy Institute in New Delhi. So Philippe and Akshay, thank you very much for joining me this morning.
Nice to see you, Lyle.
All right, let's get started with a kind of a scene-setting question for both of you, which is, how would you characterize the approaches that China and India have taken in the relationship with the EU? What do you think sets them apart, their two strategies? And so Akshay, let me start with you on India and then Philippe with China.
Thank you, Lyle. I think to really answer that question, it's important just to recollect even perhaps from the early 2000s, over the course of the last 2 decades, how the European Union has been perceived also in India. There was a time when the European Union as an entity together was not understood as well as a political entity across all the policy-making bodies here and across the mainstream business sectors. You have to understand that India's relations, the bilateral relations, say with Germany or with France or other European countries, go back much further than the relations it currently has with the European Union as a political union. And so if you look at some of the incidences, so for instance, when the transatlantic financial crisis took place, the European Union became somewhat, and rightly so, inward-looking So at that time, the perception in India was that the policymakers here and the businesses and the community was trying to understand how to perceive what European Union is going to do versus what the countries individually is going to do. And so and similarly, when sanctions were being imposed on Russia and Iran about 15, 20 years ago, European Union followed the American foreign policy and the United Nations sanctions. So to a large extent, European Union as an entity always seemed a bit obstructionist to the work that would be required to be done in India, because Indians already had a working relationship, perfectly well working relationship with the different countries individually. Of course, the benefits of the European Union have started to emerge now. I would not just say not immediate, but over the course of the last decade, where the value has really started to become more and more apparent. And so, and I think the perception for India and the European Union, in my view, was also somewhat unfairly perhaps seen through the lens of our commitments to the WTO or our commitments to other global governance issues, including climate change. The good news is that the relationship between India and European Union now has become multifaceted. In fact, I would even go ahead and compare this to what I see with India and the United States, where the relationship has become so multi-layered and multidimensional that one or two prickly issues alone are not enough to stop the momentum that India has with the European Union now. So, of course, it helps that European Union has come up with an Indo-Pacific strategy. So that collectively puts a strategic perspective. Of course, Germany and France have their own country-specific strategies on the Indo-Pacific too. But there are other developments that have taken place. So, for instance, the launch of the Federation of European Businesses in India, which is the business chamber representing the European Union or European businesses in India, that was a very important development in 2024. It really brings together all the policy and regulatory issues that need to be put front and center, and there's one body to do that. Similarly, the launch of the European Union Trade and Technology Council in 2023, which Philippe has also mentioned in his excellent paper. So with the launch of the EU Trade and Technology Council and the launch of the Federation of European Businesses in India, these are all indicators of how India and European Union are now really interacting at a very high level, policy orbit, which otherwise was an aspiration for many years. I do want to make a point that, if you go down some of these issues, it's you can see that India and EU have like a maritime security dialogue, cyber security dialogue, clean energy dialogue, and so on. So there's a range of working groups, and I think, of course, on track one that really helps. So, in my view, the evolution of India's relationship with the European Union as an entity, and the work that policymakers have done in both sides in upgrading the level of engagement and creating agencies and institutions on both sides to engage has been really, really important. And so I would start there. And this has only happened in the last, I would say, last 5 years, where we've seen this marked change in relations. Of course, the bilateral relations remain very, very strong. You've seen with Germany and with France. With France, we have a relationship on defense, civil nuclear, and so on, support of the United Nations Security Council. With Germany, of course, we have a G4 relationship for reform of the United Nations Security Council. So there are bilateral relations with Italy, Poland, Denmark, and so on that we can get into a little bit more in detail as we go on through this session.
Great seed setter, Akshay. Thanks. So, Philippe, to China, I mentioned in my opening remarks about the heyday in the 1990s of, EU-China trade was booming. China enters the WTO, enters the WTO. And then you seem to have a recent shift in the EU kind of sentiment towards China and policy towards China. So now in 2025, right now, how would you characterize kind of the China-EU relationship, and what are some of the kind of the big challenges that you're seeing?
Yes, Lyle. So if we go back to history, it's a little similar to what Ashke was saying about India. It started with bilateral relations between China and countries such as France, the UK, Germany, especially these three. I mean, I could add Sweden and so on. And the relationship with the EU became more significant when the EU itself became a trade body and became responsible for trade between members of the European Union and foreign countries. So this is what's happening. But at the very beginning, of course, when China started opening up in the early 1980s, then of course not only governments started engaging with the PRC governments, but also companies, and they started using China, just like many other countries, started using China as a subcontractor, a manufacturing place, and also increasingly as a market. And of course, China was trying to attract more foreign companies, including Indian companies, by promising access to this market. Now, gradually, of course, the EU became more important as a body in Chinese eyes. And in fact, President Xi Jinping himself visited Brussels only once, actually, but that was in 2014, quite a long time ago. But that was considered an acknowledgement of the fact the EU was now representing European countries and European businesses as well, in at least in the trade and economic domains, which, by the way, is by far the most important in Chinese eyes when it comes to Europe. I mean, China speaks to the French president or the German chancellor individually, but when it comes to big, governance issues, I don't think they would speak to the EU. They would speak with Ursula von der Leyen on trade, on investments, and in fact, as you said, there are a number of irritants in this relationship, which has led not only the EU to come up with this triptych calling China in 2019 a partner, an economic competitor, and systemic rival, but also implementing a number of mechanisms, such as an investment screening mechanism, an anti-coercion instrument, and an anti-subsidies instrument as well, and many others that are, of course, not liked in China, but that reflect an increasing competition and unbalance between Europe and China. In other words, when after the 2008 crisis, 2008 financial crisis, mainly in Europe, Chinese companies started buying shares or utilities or infrastructures, particularly in Southern Europe. Suddenly, that came as a bit of a warning that some of the European countries might face competition from China in their home countries. So meanwhile, of course, I'm sure we'll come to that, but the sort of global context we are in is kind of pushing Europe, in the arms of other countries, and perhaps the two countries we are addressing today, mainly India and China, are part of this. But of course, they have different aspects, and the trade volume, of course, between the EU and China is enormous. 635 billion in 2024. There's also, a trade deficit, which is, very massive. Also, on investment, both the EU in China and China in the EU have invested massively. When you look at India, it's a slightly different context, but I'm sure we'll come to that in a moment.
Great. So, Philippe, staying with you on this question, you recently wrote a very insightful paper for the Center for China Analysis entitled "A New Triangle: The Interplay Between China and EU-India Relations." And you examine this question of whether the EU-India relationship could evolve into, potentially a closer partnership, especially in light of, recent EU-China trade tensions and national security concerns. So, looking at India, what is your overall conclusion from the paper? And this is kind of a theme that we're talking about in this webinar of, do you think that India can emerge as as an alternative to China in Europe to replace Beijing, or do you think that's just media headlines and doesn't quite capture kind of what India's role could be in the EU?
So, Lyle, I think it really depends at what level and in what field. There is the economic dimension, which of course is growing with increasing interest from India into the EU and vice versa. Visits by CEOs and interest in the India market, in defense, pharmaceuticals, luxury, aviation, footwear, and a number of things. But I think the real question is the strategic level, and whether at the moment, with such a shift in big power competition and the multipolar world we live in, whether India, which is a major player, of course, of the global South, and perhaps the only country that can counter China in this environment, whether it can offer an alternative partnership to the EU. And in fact, we mentioned Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission. By the way, she visited New Delhi in February of this year with the entire college of European commissioners, 27 of them, which is the first time ever in any country. So that's a sign, of course, that when you have the entire group of commissioners visiting New Delhi, that there is something happening. And in fact, she said quite clearly that the world is fraught with danger, and that the great power competition is an opportunity for Europe and India to reimagine their partnership. And of course, with China, it's a complete different situation. You have bilateral visits. You had a number of European leaders visiting China. President Xi Jinping visited Europe last year, but he picked France for an anniversary, the 60th anniversary of Sino-French diplomatic relations. But he also picked Hungary and Serbia, two countries that are very close ideologically to China, and that are not heavyweights, in the European context, and certainly not Serbia, which is not even a member of the EU. So I think the EU-India relationship is becoming pivotal. I don't know whether it will entirely counterbalance China's rise. As we know, China is rising across the board and has been rising for quite some time, as both of you know really well. But India is really the new player among big powers, and certainly it creates an opening for the EU, in fact, for others such as the US as well. And Prime Minister Modi, of course, has been very active and he's engaged a lot, and he's visited Europe several times. And I think there's a real willingness from the EU, including from the business community, to engage with New Delhi. So overall, I think it will take some time for India to catch up, and certainly in terms of infrastructures, in terms of on the economic front, But diplomatically, on the other hand, I think India has a lot of openings, and of course, India is not a permanent member of the Security Council. There are a number of issues, but at the moment, the situation is quite favorable to India.
Great, thanks, Philippe. And Akshay, same question to you. And you kind of touched on this in your first comment, about there's different layers within the EU-India relationship, and it kind of depends on what layer we're talking about, strategic versus kind of business versus diplomatic, security and defense. But clearly the EU and China are strengthening cooperation, and you mentioned security and defense, infrastructure, IT is a big one. So, I guess same question to you about like the counterbalance of India and its potential to not replace, but kind of compete with China in the EU. So in what ways do you think they have a strategic advantage in the EU vis-a-vis China? And what ways do you think it's a harder time competing based on China's kind of competitive advantages?
I think fundamentally here, one of the most important characteristics about India, when we think of India as a rising economic power, is to really appreciate that it is a market economy. I think this characteristic sometimes, at least in my view, is a little underappreciated sometimes across the world, but perhaps also in the European Union. And that makes it one of our strongest advantages when we're dealing with not just the European Union, but with other countries that want to partner with us, specifically in the context of competing with China. How many nations this year in financial year 26, India is expected to cross a total trade of $1 trillion. How many countries can you count that have a total trade of over $1 trillion? They're less than 10. And how many can you count in Asia? So we have Japan, you have Korea, China, of course, but after China is Japan, Korea, perhaps Vietnam, which is inching closer, just like we are, towards the $1 trillion mark. So when we look around the world of the potential, this is a very big indicator, as is the fact that the market capitalization of our stock market today is at $5 trillion. I mean, this is only behind NASDAQ and NYSE and Shanghai and Tokyo. It's the fifth largest stock market capitalization in the world. And it's above the London Stock Exchange, Hong Kong Stock Exchange, Euronext, and Deutsche Börse. So, I think our market economy, the promise it holds, and the promise it holds for European investors. By the way, very few people actually even recall that Deutsche Börse actually had a 5% stake in Bombay Stock Exchange between 2007 and 2020. So there's all kinds of economic exchanges. It helps that today, when we look at stability, that we have $680 billion of foreign exchange reserves, which is, above Saudi Arabia and Russia. Like, it's, again, the third or fourth largest in the world. So, and then there is not just the financial markets. It's also that we have a consumer market, a digital market, a carbon market, which is coming up. So I think that our strength of our market economy is, I think, one of the strongest pillars of the promise that we hold. And it provides transparency and regulation, which I think is, both of those things are characteristics that the European Union would particularly value. It is difficult to compete with China. It's a giant economically and as a trading power. There are areas in which, as we look ahead, we are seeing challenges and preparing for it. So, for instance, we have known for a few years now that the future is in green economy and digital economy. And both of those areas, we see a domination by China in in the raw materials or in the technologies that we need for climate mitigation or for electric vehicles, batteries, solar panels, wind turbines. And then, of course, I think it's probably common knowledge by now that such a large part of critical minerals are also based in China. So when we look at green economy and digital economy as a future, we find that China's dominance exists, and that's where we still need to compete. And of course, government has its own ways on what they're trying, including the private sector. But I think in the end, our market economy is probably what's going to is what is going to stand the test of time and offer European Union the chance to really shift away. And I think no one else, no other country today provides that scale of a market, financial market, consumer market, carbon market, digital market.
Mm. So, Philippe, turning back to you, and again, your paper, touched on this issue of de-risking in the China-EU relationship, and how much of an important factor, the term de-risking has become. Whether you use the term de-risking or not, but supply chain resiliency, making sure that your relationship, your economic relationship with China is immune from certain kind of more sensitive technology, and national security concerns. So, you touched on how much the EU has changed its tone on China. So my question to you is, do you think that this new normal is going to continue when it comes to, the emphasis of the EU on de-risking when it comes to China? Is this here to stay? And how, and so it's a two-part question. A, is this here to stay? And then second, what is China doing to respond to kind of the bigger emphasis on de-risking? What is their strategy? Are they shifting and adopting new strategies to kind of work around this de-risking concern? And what are you seeing, how, their response based on the kind of the EU's, bigger focus on de-risking?
But I think, the term de-risking was first employed by Ursula von der Leyen 2 years ago in a speech in Brussels, just ahead of a trip that she did to Beijing with President Macron of France. And this is really was setting the tone in the continuity of that triptych I mentioned earlier. And clearly she listed areas where there are risks for European companies vis-a-vis China, quantum computing, semiconductors, AI, biotech. These are areas where, of course, China is a direct competitor with, particularly German technology, but not just German. And this is something that 10 years ago, German industrialists were not so concerned about. You would go to Berlin and try to meet people who would give you a diverging view on China, and you would hardly find anyone. And now, of course, it's a very different situation because China has become much more assertive and has championed national players who are now going around the world and including in Europe, in fact, and that is something of concern. So when you look at the state of affairs now between China and the EU, there are a number of problems on the trade side. The main problem, I would say, is what Akshay was saying at the beginning, where China is a dominant player in green tech, in batteries, in solar panels, and and this is, from our own making in many ways. Like you may remember that Chancellor Angela Merkel at the time, more than 10 years ago, sort of gave up on the solar panel industry in Germany, and basically that opened the door to Chinese manufacturers into the European markets. If you look at, what's happening on the electric vehicle front, for example, where the Chinese manufacturers are performing really well in a very impressive way. They control the value chains, the production lines, all the way to their markets, including the logistics and shipping, and they're able to produce an electric vehicle that is basically half the price of a Europe-made car or truck. And of course, as you know, I mean, the EU has reacted by imposing tariffs on Chinese EVs, different tariffs depending on which brand, by the way, whether it's BYD or Geely or others. And of course, China, in the typical PRC mode, has reacted by imposing tariffs on other sectors. One of them that is very close to the heart of French people, that's Cognac. And the problem is Cognac is sort of a victim. So the whole Cognac business in China is now down due to the to this trade war on electric vehicles. So President Macron was on the phone with his Chinese counterpart the other day, just before he actually took off to Southeast Asia, where he is at the moment. And there seem to be some progress. But there are other, fires starting in other areas. For example, there's also some investigation on tires, on Chinese tires, by the European Commission. And so China is now warning that it's concerned about anti-dumping investigations from Brussels. So it might escalate again. So it sort of course, it reminds us of other trade wars that are happening in the rest of the world. But this is not a sort of peaceful situation. I mean, on one hand, you have thousands of European companies still based in China. I think the European Chamber of Commerce in Beijing has 1,700 members. That's quite a lot. That's much more from the Indian equivalent, the Phoebe that we discussed earlier, we talked about earlier. But there's great potential for growth in India. In China, between China and the EU, of course, trade is going on. It's reduced, investment is being reduced. And somewhat, I find that we're reaching a plateau, perhaps. The expectations from European businesses vis-à-vis the China market are much lower. And that's, of course, the 3 years of pandemic and the Chinese policies vis-à-vis foreign companies, and the number of European expats as well has gone down dramatically. And it's very hard for China to attract back all these Europeans. China doesn't have the same image in the EU that it had, even though, again, the global context might be helping China in some ways. It's difficult for China, and the Chinese government keeps saying, they share so much with the EU in terms of global governance and climate. And the French Minister for Climate and Ecology is in Beijing right now, and this is perhaps one of the areas where Europeans and Chinese are working together, and they're perhaps being helped by the fact that President Trump has threatened to leave the Paris Climate Accord again. So this is one area where things are going well. On technology and trade and investment, it's really, I mean, we've reached a different phase And of course, there's huge concern in Europe about the next few years, the economic situation, jobs, and China has invested in Europe, but hasn't created many job opportunities. Now, of course, the hope with regard to India is that India will come and perhaps invest as well, and that this would work slightly better. Or there's another possibility that China will perhaps change its investment policy, and rather than buying shares or equity, would actually invest in greenfield investments in Europe and create value for the future of the European economies, which of course are worried to be squeezed, just like many countries in the world, between the United States on one hand and China on the other hand. So we are reaching a new phase, and I think there are expectations from a number of European leaders that China will perhaps change its attitude, and we've just reached the 10th anniversary of the Made in China 2025. Now, of course, we understand China is going to continue to push its own industries and technologies, but if it wants to be seen as a constructive player, global player, then it needs perhaps to engage differently with the rest of the world, including with European countries.
Akshay, let me turn to you for the same question about de-risking, but kind of drilling down on the IT supply chain sector. And so, clearly India has the ambition to compete with Beijing in IT and possibly replace some Chinese companies in some segments of the IT industry. Clearly India has a very large domestic market, an abundance of labor, preferential government policies, trying to attract FDI to India. And then just the sheer size of its economy and investments in the IT sector is, India's positioning itself, it seems clearly to be a top destination for IT and supply chains. And so, given the de-risking emphasis from the EU towards China, and given that India, clearly wants to compete with China in the IT industry, what is your assessment of its capability to compete? I mean, clearly China's a heavyweight, they have a lot of advantages, but India's making inroads, it seems. And so what is your prognosis about, long-term India's ability to compete with China in the IT sector, and what are some of its bottlenecks or its challenges?
Capability is slightly easier to answer because that's visible and there's data and there's evidence of what is going on. When NASSCOM, the IT body, did a report in December 2024, it clocked 1,800 global capability centers, which is but they're not called outsourcing centers because they're doing much more than just outsourcing. Or business process outsourcing, which used to be the case a couple of decades ago. Now they're doing R&D and including filing patents and so on. So that's 1,800 with more than nearly $65 billion in revenue. If you look at AI talent, I believe we have like 25 to 30% of the world's AI talent because of all the engineers that we are producing. And of course, the India co-chairing the Artificial Intelligence Summit, along with President Macron in France earlier this year, was an indication of the role it wants to play in global governance of artificial intelligence and its uses. I think we have a lot which is going for us, and it's not potential, it's visible. I would underline that we have even a bigger advantage that is rather implicit, and that is trust. as we move into a phase where, we're moving away from, efficiency and low cost driven motivations for international partnerships towards security driven, or at least security being as important as market driven criteria for an economic or a technology partnership. I think India is really well placed. I mean, it's a transparent market and we enjoy the trust, we have the credibility. We have taken, we're transparent with our auctions, with the way we deploy technology. I think India was the first one, if I'm not wrong, that banned TikTok. We have our own foreign investment screening mechanisms. We've not allowed Huawei to come into our 5G or 6G infrastructure, and there's additional screening there. Whereas India's just inked deals. Indian companies have inked deals with Starlink to actually bring satellite telecom now into India. So that's with the United States. And of course, the technology partnerships with France and Germany. I mean, they go back quite a few decades, but all the technology is now being upgraded to be used even in critical infrastructure. The challenge is that it's not a challenge, it's more of it's a challenge for European companies sometimes because they're not able to market their own success as well in India sometimes. I saw a survey where it was the perception of German businesses in India, where Siemens was at 3% and BMW was at 47%. Because of course, BMW is a consumer-oriented brand, so there's more brand recognition. But Siemens is perhaps, I don't want to oversimplify what they do, but they're doing so much work on electrification and technology and telecom and railways and so on. In fact, Siemens revenue I checked for this purpose, it's $2.5 billion, whereas BMW is $1 billion. So it's more than 2.5 times. This is all to say that, some of the successes in technology are not as obvious in the mainstream because it's happening behind and it's sometimes invisible. And the European companies are integrated into the Indian market and they have a presence. Prime Minister Modi just flagged off Siemens built locomotives last week in India. I mean, these are huge. This is interesting case studies, and I would think good success stories that need to be told. So I think there is capacity, there is capability, there is room for there's room for demonstration here, which I think can be done a little bit better. But we really have going for us, if we continue down the path that we have, is transparency and trust, and all the other efforts that we do with digital public infrastructure, India Stack, and so on, are all attempts to provide a transparent technology architecture to the world for its use. So I think that's an important and rather defining characteristic of our technology economy. And I think it's only going to become more visible as the economy and the GDP goes past the $5 trillion mark. I mean, we're now the fourth largest, but as it crosses, we just crossed Japan a few weeks ago. So we're behind United States, China, and Germany and global GDP. So, but at $4.7 trillion. But as we cross the $5 trillion mark, $6 trillion mark, and as technology becomes more mainstream, this is going to become more visible.
Great. So let me, I have two more questions and then we'll open up to audience Q&A. If you have any questions, please put it into the Q&A box and I'll try to get to it. So the first is on Trump tariffs and the effect on both China and India on its relations with the EU. So, there are reports out there that India is in talks with the Trump administration on reducing the U.S. tariffs towards India. And then and then of course we all know the ongoing talks between the U.S. and China on tariffs. But this is probably, I would imagine, is a little bit of a curveball for both capitals, diminishing or damaging their kind of economic prospects around the world, but particularly for the EU. So So, Philippe, starting with you, what is your just general kind of very strategic level look at the effect of the U.S. tariffs on China when it comes to its investments abroad, especially in the EU? And then same question to you, Akshay, about India.
Yeah, so I mean, the Chinese companies have been very busy looking for opportunities all over the world. I would say in Europe, in particular. I mentioned earlier some EV projects and battery projects, but again, these are fairly controversial fields. But Spain, for example, and Hungary will both welcome Chinese investments in automobile, and a battery factory should be set up in the north of France. So these are fairly small projects as opposed to like EU investment in China, for example. And of course, the trade deficit between the EU and China has widened over the past years, and that is also the reason why the global relationship is not really improving, because European leaders, whoever they are, when they travel to China and meet Chinese officials, and in fact, there will be an EU-China summit in Beijing in July, and I'm sure on top of the list will be, as usual, the trade deficit and how to attract, how to get Chinese consumers to buy European products and to make the unbalance rebalanced. So this is going to be a remaining problem, because there's a sense that basically China wants to use its overcapacity, and in fact, that was the original plan with the Belt and Road Initiative, if you recall, was to use the overcapacity of steel and aluminium to sell it all the way to Europe. Now it became, of course, a much more extensive project. But there is this impression in Europe that China wants to sell us everything they can't sell to their own people. So why don't they just increase, local sales, and why don't they become a more sort of a transparent and open economy? Just one word on India, of course, I think things, as Akshay said, are becoming much more detailed and technical through the TTC, the Technology and Trade Council between the EU and China, which now has listed a number of areas where Europeans and Indians have to work together. For example, wastewater management, recycling batteries, interoperability of charging infrastructure for EVs, standards. They've been working on, companies have been working together on workshops, on charging technologies and standardization processes. So there are things happening on the EU-China front. I think we will know more in July, and I know I was referring to climate change issues and green technologies. Again, China is moving very fast in green tech, no doubt. Anybody who's been to China recently knows that. And India has still got a lot of catching up to do. But again, it has to be two sides, and I think Europeans basically don't want the solar panel saga to come back, through the EVs and other industries where China has become, a champion, and this is what people have in mind.
Akshay, same question to you about Trump tariffs on India.
I have an immediate short-term answer, and then there's a long-term possibility that I'd like to put on the table. On the short term, I think that the discussions on the tariffs are somewhat oversimplified, because it is restricted to certain product lines and the tariff lines across those products. And, and how they can be gradually brought down to zero. And underlying all of this is, what is the trade deficit and how you can balance the deficit. I think for all of us, one, we need to just recognize the underlying interest for the United States, at $34 trillion of deficit, cumulative deficit, and $1.5 to $2 trillion deficit every year in their budget. This was coming, and so I think perhaps the way it is unraveling is disruptive. And specifically for India and the United States, because then you asked the question, it's also about it's about looking at the full jigsaw puzzle, if you will, right? So there is the product lines, but for instance, there's deep relationship and very high value relationship in defense, energy, and that can easily turn the numbers the other way around. And so I think that one is looking at those high ticket items. The second is also looking at finance, because a lot of the investment, and it's not just about exports, it's also about how capital is flowing along with the trade. So because we're talking about EU and China, one of the things that the European companies have been doing in China for a long time, particularly the auto companies like Volkswagen and BMW, is they have been launching panda bonds in mainland China to raise funds for their operations in China. And at one point, I remember, even with the US, I have a statistic for the US, not for Europe, but at one point, 75% of high-tech exports out of China were from American companies. So if you look at these two together, what the Europeans are doing in raising finance and how the American companies were exporting out of China, just goes to show that there are so many additional dimensions to what creates an export surplus. And so for coming back to India, I think what will matter is what we put in that basket for negotiations. I mean, some of those, the negotiations that are taking place right now are confidential and kept under wraps. So I do not know the details. And the second thing is, how will we actually formulate a policy that will ensure that we can also enable companies to raise capital here? Because enabling German or French or Danish companies to raise capital here will only attract European businesses. So I think there's more there than meets the eye, and I think the discussions which are actually taking place in the track one are going to take these into account. I'm sure of that.
Great. All right, we have 7 minutes left. I want to ask a very quick question with a quick answer for both of you about Russia, Ukraine, and then we'll get to the audience Q&A. So, kind of rapid fire question to both of you. How has India's and China's position on the Russian war in Ukraine negatively, positively, or had no impact on its relations with the EU? It's kind of just a very broad question, your quick takeaway. Philippe, let me start with you and then Akshay.
So, definitely China's role and closeness to Vladimir Putin's Russia has not helped its image in Europe, and it has sort of added on to other issues which I've exposed earlier, and also, the pandemic, which has also not improved China's image. Regular visits by President Xi to Moscow and vice versa have also shown that this is a very long-term partnership. This is not something on the side. So this has really. The fact that, of course, both China and India are part of BRICS means that there are different views from the global south, no doubt, and Russia is part of that too. But certainly, we see from a European viewpoint a very close Sino-Russian relationship.
Mm-hmm. Akshay, same question to you about India.
I think there's probably an answer that is more security and strategic, and another one that is more economic, but they're interrelated. Perhaps visibly, in the public domain, there was some expectation for India to be more vocal in support of the European position. But I think the Indian government has done, I think, I think, I think reasonably well in articulating its position, not just because we were neutral, but because we were also, in the end, refining the crude oil that was coming out of Russia and actually providing it back to the Western capitals. So I think there was, under the covers, there was some understanding that you needed a country like India that can both talk to both capitals, and that there was an understanding that there's some economic benefit to having India also be able to refine the crude petroleum that was coming their way. So maybe I'll just stop there. I think that I cannot speak to how it might have what the sentiments in Europe are right now, but in my view, I think in the policy circuit at least, I think that seems to have been accepted as a reasonable position.
Mm-hmm. All right, so I'm going to pose two questions from the audience to you two. One audience member asks, how does sectarianism play into India's international role? And that's for you, Akshay. And then for you, Philippe, we have a question, kind of two questions. One is about Chinese BYD investment in Hungary. How important is that investment, and how much of an impact will that have on Chinese kind of economic presence within the EU? And then a question that you sort of answered, Philippe, but just want to touch on it, which is the Trump tariffs on China. Will that open up Chinese overcapacity even more for the EU? In other words, will that kind of accelerate Chinese overcapacity issues and kind of dumping, if you will, into the EU market because of the Trump tariffs? So Akshay, question for you first, and then over to you, Philippe.
Not sure if the person asking the question is talking about sectarianism in Europe, in the world, or in India.
I think it's in India.
But I think that the straightforward answer and the evidence is actually our relation with the Gulf. India today enjoys perhaps its best relations ever with the GCC countries. And the relationship with Saudi Arabia, with Kuwait, with Bahrain, with the United Arab Emirates has never been better. And so I think that the Indonesian president was the chief guest for our Republic Day. So I think that I think that those who are truly serious and understand the value of what India is doing within borders and outside truly understand the distinction between what it takes, and truly understand the value of what it takes to run a democracy, to have a democracy, to have elections where 800 million people are voting, producing a mandate for somebody to run the country, and not to mention that there's state elections and third layer of government in towns and villages. So if that was not the case, I do not think that India's relations would be diversified and would be so well recognized across all the different countries, like different kinds of countries around the world, which may be which it could be the Gulf countries, Israel, the United States, Europe, or otherwise.
Philippe? I'll be very quick. I mean, I think, Hungary, of course, yes, that's a kind of greenfield investment. Huawei was an investor, and now BYD in Hungary. Hungary is an odd case because it's a country that is actually part of the EU, but is very critical of the EU, and has been, as we know, very close to China and to Russia. So it's a little bit tricky. But they do have access to the rest of the European market. Of course, that makes it beautiful in terms of Chinese investment. I don't know in terms of job creations and what it's going to lead to. And generally, I think yes, the overcapacity of China has been is a threat to to renew in the sense that the U.S. market is no longer as open as it was to Chinese products. So I do worry about that too.
Great. That brings us to the end of our webinar. Thank you so much, Philippe and Akshay, for your participation. Thank you to the online audience for joining and for the questions. And please join us again for the next event. And for now, please take care. And thanks again, Philippe and Akshay.